Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. How great was Alexander as a general? In this opening part of the lecture, we're going to discuss Alexander's three major battles against the Persians: the Granicus River in 334 BC, Issus in 333 BC, and Gaugamela in 331 BC. As a result of his victories in these battles, the Persian Empire would be incorporated into the Macedonian Empire, and Alexander would become Lord of Asia. We will then briefly touch upon Alexander's campaigns in Bactria and Sogdiana in India, where he pulled off a spectacular victory at the Battle of the Hydaspes River in 326 BC. And all of these battles are definite testimony to Alexander's military genius and strategic planning, and they are what ultimately led him to being called the Great. But what I want to do after that, looking at these battles, is to consider aspects of Alexander's generalship that show a different side to it, and which I believe affect his military greatness. Well, to begin, in the spring of 334 BC, Alexander led his army of about 15,000 infantry and 2,000 cavalry from Pella to the Hellespont, that is, to the body of water that separated Europe from Asia. He picked up more troops from his allies along the way. Alexander left behind the general Antipater as guardian of Greece and deputy hegemon of the League of Corinth. By the time the Macedonian army crossed the Hellespont, it numbered about 48,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry, and it was supported by a fleet of 120 warships. Greek and Persian history from this point on would forever change. Just before landing in Asia, Alexander threw a spear into Asian soil, saying that he accepted it as a gift from the gods. In other words, he was proclaiming that Asia was now spear-won territory. And this was not just a symbolic gesture. It indicated that Alexander saw Asia as his own because the gods were on his side. And I think it is deliberate that he wanted to show he wanted all of Asia for his empire. And this was a big difference, I think, from the mandate of the League of Corinth, which was to liberate the Greeks of Asia Minor, to punish the Persians. Remember, these were the motivations that Philip had given to the League for why he was going to lead this expedition into Asia. This is different now. It's a big difference, in fact, from what Philip had envisioned. And I believe Philip had intended to campaign only in and around Asia Minor. So Alexander was showing that he intended to do much more of his own thing, even before he set foot on Asian soil. The battles and sieges that Alexander undertook in Asia show his military genius and the superb fighting ability of the Macedonian army. It was this army that he inherited from his father Philip that would ultimately lead to all of his great military successes. In three battles, Alexander defeated the Persians, ultimately absorbing Persia into the Macedonian Empire that his father had begun to establish back on the mainland. At its height, Alexander's empire would stretch from Greece to what the Greeks called India, which is modern-day Pakistan, and that is the furthest eastern expanse of it, but it would also stretch south down into Egypt. Now, Philip admittedly did not conquer anything on that scale, so that is perhaps the reason why he is not the household name that Alexander is. But let us not forget that without Philip, Alexander would have accomplished little. So no Philip, no Alexander. And that is a point that I'm going to stress repeatedly. Back on the mainland, the Greeks may well have been cowed by Macedonia, as we talked about last time. But in Athens, at least, the flame of opposition continued to burn. We have no political speeches by Demosthenes in the assembly from this period, but we know that he made some. It appears that he still maintained an anti-Macedonian policy, but its basis was no longer the need for a citizen army to strike against Macedonia, no longer the idea of uniting the Greeks against Macedonia either. Instead, Demosthenes' policy was now based on the hope that the Persians would defeat Alexander, that they would probably kill him, and that Greece would then go back to being its old self. Within a few years of Alexander landing in Asia, quite to the contrary of these expectations, it was the Persians who were defeated, and so ended this aspect of Demosthenes' policy. Now, the first battle against a Persian army was fought in 334 BC at the Granicus River. This was the satrapy, this was in the satrapy of Hellespontine Phrygia in the northwest part of the Persian Empire. The Persian Empire, the Persian army here at this battle included 20,000 cavalry and 20,000 Greek mercenaries. But Darius III, the great king, the Persian king, was not there, and that is why this battle is often called the satraps' battle in the sources. The satrap, or governor of this area, was a man named Arsaces, and he was the one calling the shots. And he was the one who decided to engage the Macedonians in battle. There was another general there named Memnon, who knew the Greeks, and what Memnon wanted to do was to pursue a kind of scorched earth policy, because he knew that without provisions, Alexander's army would have to go home. But Arsaces, of course, did not want to have his entire satrapy burned down, so he overrode Memnon's advice and forced an actual battle. He shouldn't have done this, as events would prove, but nevertheless, that is what he did. The Persians drew up their line on the east bank of the river, and Alexander led his army to the west bank. Each line was about a mile long. Alexander obviously had to cross the river in order to keep advancing into Asia, so a battle was inevitable. The Granicus River was only about 3 feet deep, but it was very wide at about 80 feet. It was fast flowing, and the banks on both sides were very steep, and it's still like that today. You can still go and walk this battlefield, actually, and see it, as I have done myself. Now, although Parmenion, the general, advised caution, and he even suggested to Alexander that they try to find another way around the river so as not to engage the Persians so early on in the invasion, Alexander simply ignored him. Alexander decided to move at speed, and this we're going to see as a characteristic of his. He led his men down the west bank and crossed the river in a diagonal line, left to right, so that the Persians would focus on the flank nearest to them. This was the flank that took the heaviest casualties, and the maneuver has been rightly described by modern historians as a pawn sacrifice. However, this pawn sacrifice allowed the Macedonian line to push its way up the opposite bank, that is, the east bank, and regroup as it approached the top into a straight line. Now, the superb training of the Macedonian army, which of course they had gained under Philip, proved itself yet again. The Persian cavalry gave way first, followed by the infantry, as the Macedonian line attacked. It was a rout, and according to the ancient sources, 20,000 Persian infantry and 250,000 cavalry were killed at this battle, but only 34 on Alexander's side. So we have, of course, an impossible manipulation of the numbers going on here. It had to have been more than 34. If it was a pawn sacrifice, that would have been a very small pawn otherwise. But nevertheless, you get the idea that the casualties were very disproportionate. One person who almost died in this battle at the Granicus, however, was Alexander himself. Alexander was always in the midst of the fighting, not just because this was the expectation of a Macedonian warrior king, which it was. Philip had been no different, but because Alexander liked fighting. Think about this as we deal with him. Did Alexander know anything else but fighting? And that is a question that I often like to put to students. Really, what was his training really in anything in any other way of kingship? That was really the only aspect that he really developed, as we will see as we look at his reign. But returning to the battle itself, at Granicus, Alexander's helmet was sheared off by Darius's son-in-law, one Mithridates. And just literally at the moment when another person raised his sword to attack Alexander's bare head, the Macedonian general Cleitus, also known as Cleitus the Black because of his jet black hair, he galloped in time and lopped off the Persian's right arm. Otherwise, Alexander would have lost his head. Well, after the Battle of the Granicus, Alexander marched down the coast of Asia Minor, receiving the surrender of towns or capturing others by siege as he did so. Then, in the spring of 333 BC, he detoured to Gordian, close to the modern-day Turkish capital of Ankara. Um, Here it was that the wagon dedicated by Midas, son of Gordius, lay. This is the same Midas as with the golden touch. Um, and this was the Gordius, this father of Midas was the Gordius who was believed to have left Macedonia and ended up as a king in Gordian. Now, the wagon that was there was famous for a knot that it had connecting its kind of the harness, or the kind of part that would go around the horses, to the actual wagon itself. And it was this knot made out of cornel wood on the yoke of the wagon, and it was said that whoever undid the knot would rule all of Asia. Okay. And the story went that Alexander, when he looked at this impossible knot, that was just, you couldn't undo it. The word to undo in Greek, you see, the verb is luein. It's a little bit more ambiguous than to untie. It could mean to untie, or can simply mean to undo in some other way. And so the story goes that Alexander, looking at it and realizing that he could not untie it, took out his sword and simply cut the Gordian knot. If you've ever heard that as an expression, when a person solves a problem in a totally unorthodox manner, they cut the Gordian knot. But at the actual moment, the symbolism was obvious. Alexander was now making it clear to all and sundry that he was the one fated to rule all of Asia. And that night, we are told, there was another violent thunderstorm, and Alexander interpreted this as his father Zeus welcoming the new ruler of Asia. By now, Alexander was getting reports that Darius was leading a vast army from Babylon against him. The two sides would meet in battle in the summer of 333 at Issus. The actual location of the battle is unknown, but it was fought on a plain by the modern Gulf of Iskenderun. Despite the overwhelming numerical superiority of the Persians, Alexander attacked first. His strategy was to penetrate the Persian line with his cavalry, to get behind it, and then to go after Darius himself, because he believed that if he could kill or capture Darius, then the Persians would lose heart. Now, I've mentioned before that Philip knew his Greek history. Well, so too did Alexander. In Alexander's strategy, I see him here probably remembering what had happened to the Persians after Xerxes had fled in 480 BC following the Battle of Salamis. You recall that seeing his fleet decimated, the great king Xerxes fled and went back to Persia. The Persians who were left by their king lost heart because the great king wasn't there anymore. So I think that this lay behind Alexander's definite desire to be the one to actually, cut the snake off at the head. Well, Alexander never got the chance to kill or capture Darius. He never got the chance even to fight him at this battle, because when his line did smash through the Persians, Darius fled. This is the scene of a very famous mosaic that was found at Pompeii. In Pompeii, in the House of the Faun, as it's called. It is simply known as the Alexander mosaic, which you see here depicted in front of you. It supposedly depicts Alexander rushing to fight Darius before the latter fled. The mosaic is probably modeled on a contemporary painting, and it has Darius, as you see on the right-hand side, looming above Alexander as Alexander raises his spear on the left to throw it at Darius. All around, you can see the sarissas of the Macedonians. Darius and Alexander's eyes are locked on each other, and it's just those few seconds before Darius turns around and gallops off, surrounded by his 1,000-person bodyguard. It's a very famous mosaic indeed, and you can see it at the Archaeological Museum in Naples, Italy, to this day. You can just stand in front of it and just it's really quite an impressive thing to see. Even just the incredible emotion that is captured in the stones, because it is mosaic. It's all made out of stone, and the dead tree in the background, the spears, the movement of the horses, the all of it is just pure beauty, really. Um, Now, for the rest of the day, that is at the Battle of Issus and into nightfall, the Macedonian army pursued the Persians, because once the Persians knew that the great king had fled, they did indeed lose heart. Their morale suffered greatly. So the Macedonians then had a relatively easy task of just sort of chasing them, and they massacred them as they did so. The huge numbers of the Persian army now worked against them because they slowed the men down. Moreover, the infantry fled first, and that meant that the cavalry were behind the infantrymen. As the infantrymen rushed off, the cavalry, of course, that was moving much faster, came behind them and mowed their own men down, killing more in an effort to get away. We're told that the Macedonians crossed a ravine on a pile of heaped up corpses, became like a bridge of corpses. And so this was a great victory for Alexander. But at the same time, we shouldn't really underestimate the role of that the Persians themselves played in this, in their own defeat. Well, the final battle against the Persians, who were once again led by Darius, came in September in the year 331 BC at a place called Gaugamela. This is probably the modern village of Tel Gomel in northern Iraq. By then, Alexander had successfully besieged a number of places, most famously Tyre and Gaza, the Gaza that is so much in the news right now. He had come to control Syria and the Levantine coast, and he had received the submission of Egypt. Precise numbers for the Persian army at Gaugamela are not known. Some sources give 200,000 infantry and 45,000 cavalry, while other sources give 1 million infantry and 400,000 cavalry. Whatever the case of that may be, we don't know. But the Macedonian army was about 47,000 infantry and perhaps as many as 20,000 cavalry. So whatever the Persian number was, Alexander was again terribly outnumbered. Of more concern, however, for Alexander, perhaps than the actual numbers, was Darius's corps of 200 scythed chariots. That is, these chariots that had razor-sharp scythes attached to the wheels, to the chassis, and that is the yoke pole, basically. So when these men came rushing out into the middle, they would just chop the legs off of all the men that they rode past. Moreover, Darius was supported by the satrap of Bactria named Bessus. The cavalry from Bactria, as well as neighboring Sogdiana, this is northern Afghanistan, were all first class, and it was, I would say, a cavalry that was easily on par with that of the Macedonians. Alexander now had his work cut out for him. His strategy once again was to try to capture or kill Darius. The two sides, Macedonia and Persia, had been at Gaugamela for some days, and Alexander had basically conned Darius into setting up his line, not standing his men down in case the Macedonians suddenly attack. Because Darius deployed his line, that gave Alexander the chance to study it and to prepare his own defense and then attack. And so when the two sides did engage in battle, and Darius released his corps of 200 scythed chariots, the Macedonian phalanx opened up gaps on a prearranged signal so that the chariots simply thundered through them, and the Macedonians simply turned around and moved out of the way harmlessly. And then once the chariots were past, the Macedonians stepped back in and shot down the riders and horses from these chariots. Obviously, some Macedonians would have perished at the hands of these scythed chariots, but this big corps was effectively rendered null by Alexander's actions. Once again, we see the superb training of the Macedonian army. The battle would have been loud and noisy, dusty, horrid, but Alexander would have been using things like trumpets to produce a very, very shrill sound. So once his men heard whatever, the prearranged signal was, let's say 3 blows on a trumpet or something like that. Those standing at such and such particular part of the phalanx would have moved to the left, and those standing at another part would have moved to the right, creating this gap that the chariots could thunder through. Apart from an anxious few moments when the Macedonian left wing under Parmenion nearly gave way, the battle was yet another Macedonian victory. Because when gaps in the Persian line did open up, Alexander went through them in a flash. He was an excellent person to read a battlefield, to look for openings, and to be able to exploit them. The Persian losses were said to be 56,000 to the Macedonians 1,200. And again, I think that we have to take these figures with a big grain of salt. But nevertheless, it was certainly a blowout victory for the Macedonians. And Darius fled once more, this time to Bactria with Bessus. Alexander pursued Darius at first, but then gave up as night fell, and he returned to the battlefield to go and assist Parmenion. After Gaugamela, Alexander marched southwards to Babylon, where he took up residence in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar. Babylon was something like the Las Vegas of Iraq, and the army enjoyed a month there of decadence and rest and relaxation. Then the army pushed on to Susa, and there in one of the palace's rooms, Alexander came across the statues that the Persians had seized when they ransacked Athens 150 years earlier in 480 BC. And these statues included the one of Harmodius and Aristogeiton, which you see on the screen in front of you. And Alexander sent them back to Greece. By January of 330 BC, Alexander was in Persepolis, the palace of Darius and Xerxes, and according to Diodorus Siculus, this was the most hated city in Asia. Alexander's men ransacked the place, the king condoning their actions. And what is more, before the army left Persepolis 3 or 4 months later, this would be now the spring of 330 BC, the palace burned to the ground. The victory at Gaugamela meant that Alexander was in effect the great king now, although he never actually took that title. He would call himself Lord of Asia, and the burning of the palace at Persepolis was, I think, symbolic. It meant that the old order was no more. There was no new king in town. There was no great king, I should say. There was simply Alexander, the Lord of Asia. The occupation of Persepolis may have also had an impact on back on the mainland. In 331 BC, the Spartans under King Agis went to war against Antipater. You remember this was the man that Alexander had left in charge as hegemon of the Corinthian League. And the Spartans under King Agis tried to rouse the Greeks to join them in revolt. However, this war, we can't even call it really a revolt, because the Spartans were not, remember, technically members of the League of Corinth. But nevertheless, Agis's would-be rebellion was spectacularly unsuccessful. Even Demosthenes spoke out against supporting him. Antipater easily defeated and killed Agis the following year. By then, news of Alexander's successes in Asia were widely known, and the implications of his taking of Persepolis were obvious. So the Greeks might finally have been realizing that Alexander was here to stay, and they had no wish to suffer the fate that Thebes had suffered when they revolted. And this is how Alexander kept Greece cowed while he was away, as I said in my last lecture. In the meantime, back in Asia, Bessus, you remember this was that satrap that Darius had fled along with back east, and some of the other satraps turned on Darius after he had lost these 3 battles, and they actually murdered him. The story goes that Alexander caught up with Darius minutes after he was killed at a place called Hecatompylus, but nevertheless, Alexander still ordered a lavish burial for Darius in keeping with the fact that he had been the great king. Bessus, however, now declared himself the great king, and he took the name Artaxerxes V. This act forced Alexander to pursue him into Bactria and Sogdiana, And this new campaign marked a big departure from the original mandate of the League of Corinth. The Persian Empire was no more. Darius was dead, and to all intents and purposes, Alexander and all his men could go home. Although Bactria and Sogdiana were technically part of the Persian Empire, in reality, these places were far removed from from the Persian sphere of influence. The chieftains of these tribes were left to their own, uh, basically to whatever they liked to do. So it was a case, really, um, when the Persian king could call upon them if he wanted to, but essentially he just left them alone and didn't try to encroach upon their power. Alexander probably did not need to invade Bactria at this time, and this is what I mean. Um, this is what I mean by when I say that he knew nothing else but fighting. He really had no idea about the other intricacies of kingship besides the military aspect. His men didn't seem to really have much idea either, and there was considerable dissatisfaction voiced by them at Hekatompolos. In the end, Alexander won out by saying that while Bessus was alive, security of the new Asian empire would be threatened, and the new Asian empire. So Alexander's goals were, you can see, dramatically changing, and he was even more of an imperialist now. I see, by the way, in this initial descent at Hekatompolos, voiced by his men, the origins of a later mutiny against Alexander, something that we will come to shortly. Some of the hardest fighting that the Macedonians ever took part in was in Bactria and Sogdiana for the next 3 years. But by 327 BC, Bessus was dead, and Alexander believed that he had conquered those areas as well. Unfortunately for Alexander, defeated in battle doesn't mean conquered. We're talking about what is today Afghanistan. This is that area of Bactria and Sogdiana. And this is an area that we can think of even just in our own recent memory, an area that is not easily conquered. The British in the 19th century couldn't really subdue this territory. The Soviets in the 1980s could not subdue it, nor we ourselves in our longest war, we meaning Americans, in our 20-year war with the Afghanis. We could not subdue that area either. These native people are not to be conquered by anyone. And it's really just yet another example going back into ancient times of just you know, perhaps the first of just a repeat of history again and again and again. The Pashtun tribes of the present northwest frontier of Afghanistan are constantly fighting with each other, and there is there's a saying actually that the Pashtun are only united when they face a common enemy, and that was the case in 330 in the 330s BC when Alexander was there, as much as it was in 2002 into 2021. Well, after Bactria and Sogdiana, Alexander pushed on into India, or rather, in post-partition language, present-day Pakistan. Here he would fight only one major battle against the Indian prince Porus at the Hydaspes River in 326 BC. As Alexander entered India, various rulers surrendered to him, including one Taxiles, the prince of Taxila, which is about 20 miles northwest of the modern city of Islamabad. Taxila was the largest city between the Indus and the Hydaspes, or as it is known in modern terms, the Jhelum rivers. Here, Alexander learned from a neighboring prince named Porus, who ruled a large area of the Punjab between the rivers Hydaspes and Acesines, that is the modern Chenab. He had learned that Porus had defied him. This was a personal affront to Alexander. It was very similar to what the Thebans had done in 335, and look at what happened to them. Alexander immediately, therefore, set off to do battle with Porus. He met him at the Hydaspes River, and Porus had a big army with him, 4,000 cavalry, 30,000 infantry, and 200 war elephants. Alexander's strategy was to make Porus think that the entire Macedonian army was camped on the riverbank opposite to him. But in actual fact, only a small contingent of men were there. and they were burning a lot of lights and making a lot of noise to get the enemy thinking that they were all there, while under the cover of darkness, Alexander led the bulk of his army across the river downstream from Porus's forces, the idea being to attack them unexpectedly. There was a miscalculation, though, about the width of the Hydaspes, and this caused Alexander the element of surprise. Alexander got to what he thought was the other bank of the river, only to find out that it was actually a little island in the middle of the river. And it was with great difficulty that he and his men made it to the opposite bank, because the river was very swollen now because it was the monsoon season. The Macedonians engaged Porus's army, however, and victory went to them. Alexander ordered his men to wound the elephants so that they turned around and stampeded back onto the Indian line. The way that they were taught to do this, because of course elephants have an incredibly tough skin that cannot be pierced simply by a spear or an arrow. So they were taught to wound them by stabbing them in the eyes with their long sarissa spears, and one can only imagine the chaos of a blinded elephant and in terrible pain, kind of rampaging around, trampling over people. But that is the sort of thing that happened in this battle. At the same time, the Macedonian cavalry encircled the Indian line, and the battle was over. Porus survived, however, and Alexander spared him. Supposedly, it says that he was so impressed by his cunning, his daring, and all the rest of those things. But in actuality, he kind of just turned him into something of a vassal, and he to try to topple him would probably have been much more work. It would have meant dealing with then some other successor or something like that, and so it was much easier to just sort of keep him as a vassal. This victory, though, the Hydaspes, was the high point of Alexander's time in India. After it, he besieged a number of towns that defied him, massacring the inhabitants when he took them. In fact, Alexander really, there's no question that as he marched further east through Asia, the brutality increased dramatically, one might even say to genocide. And he wasn't prepared to simply stop marching east at this point, and this was his undoing. After 70 days of marching through the drenching monsoon rains, suffering dysentery, men dying from snake bites, from snakes that they had never seen before, the men had had enough. And at the Hephaestion River, this is the modern-day Beas, they mutinied. Alexander was forced. Mutiny is perhaps maybe too strong of a word. It was almost like a kind of, they went on strike. They basically said, we're not going anymore. Alexander, if he had his way, would have kept on going to Beijing, I'm sure. But Alexander was forced to turn back now. And to punish his men, he took them on an especially long march back to Greece, westwards through the Gedrosian desert, during which about a third of his men died because of the hostile natural conditions of the area. In the meantime, Bactria and Sogdiana, that is back in Afghanistan, revolted, and there wasn't a thing Alexander could do. 2 years later, in 324, at Opus, the army mutinied again, this time over Alexander's policy to discharge his veterans. He had also made it clear by now that he intended to invade Arabia, you see. His powers of persuasion, though, were unable to end the Opus mutiny in 324, and after 3 days he was successful only when he stopped talking and he shamed the men into giving in by transferring Macedonian military command to Persians. A year later, in Babylon, in June of 323 BC, Alexander would be dead, aged 32 years old and 8 months. This was on the eve of the campaign to Arabia, so he never did that, never made it home. There is no doubt that on the battlefield, Alexander was a military genius. However, these inglorious episodes at the end of his campaign in Asia that I've just briefly related to you need to make us, I think, rethink his relations with his men. And there are also aspects of this campaign that equally affected his generalship. For example, after Issus, Alexander allowed Darius to escape because he wanted to go to Egypt to consult the oracle of Zeus Ammon. This was for entirely personal reasons, but as a result, Darius was able to regroup, and Alexander was forced to do battle with him again at Gaugamela. Then we have these two mutinies at the Hydaspes River in 326 and at Opis in 324. Although Alexander was not replaced by someone else, as would have been perhaps more usually the case in a mutiny, and that's why I say it's really more like a strike than anything else. The army did indeed make it clear that they had enough of him, with where he was wanting to go, and again for why he was wanting to go there. All of these personal reasons. There was nothing in it for them anymore. And these mutinies, these strikes, these sit-downs show a vote of no confidence in Alexander as a military commander or as a king. He had lost touch with his men, and that wasn't a great thing. That is, in fact, actually the one thing that you can't do in such a situation. There's also this terrible march across the Gordian desert. And this wasn't just merely a major logistical blunder on Alexander's part. He did it for entirely personal reasons because he was miffed at the army and wanted to punish them. Some would also suggest that he might have wanted to do it because he was associating himself very closely with Dionysius, and Dionysius apparently had traveled through this Gedrosian desert. Cyrus the Great of Persia had tried to do the same thing, but had failed, and Alexander maybe wanted the personal glory of marching through this desert, regardless of the cost to his men. No matter what interpretation you put on it, again, we should not expect a king and a commander to simply disregard the safety of his men in this way. Another thing that Alexander was doing constantly was demanding reinforcement from Antipater in Greece. This was the result of these huge numbers of casualties from Alexander's campaigns. That he was stretching Antipater's forces considerably meant nothing to Alexander, who just wanted to keep marching eastwards. But a united Greek revolt could have detrimentally affected the Macedonian hegemony of Greece. And then what would he have done? He would have had to go back himself to put it down. So if you put it all together, we notice how Alexander's reasons for doing some things is often personal for his own military reputation. And in this process, this sort of narcissistic process, tens of thousands of men in his army died. Hundreds of thousands of Asians died as well, of course. And as I said earlier, there's no question that Alexander's victories were astonishing, especially given the numbers of the enemy that he always faced. And there is no question that he was prepared to fight as well. And, he was not just simply kind of like Napoleon, who said, okay, guys, you go over there 3 miles in this direction and then take that hill. There's no question about that. He was right there in the trenches with his men, fighting all the time. But at the same time, there were serious downsides to Alexander's campaigns and to him even as a general, as a military leader. And these must surely be taken into account and must make us question the degree to which we can even refer to him as great, even when it comes to the one aspect in which he is universally called that, and that is his generalship. But the same is true also when we consider Alexander as a king, and it is to that issue that I would like now to turn. How great was Alexander as a king? He won all these spectacular military battles in Asia. However, he was not just a general, he was a king. And being a general was only part of the package of being a king. So what I'd like to do right now is to look at some of his disturbing behavior and the sides of his character as he marched further eastwards that must affect our appreciation of him as a king, and hence, by extension, affect our evaluation of whether he should still be called great. As examples, I want to discuss two conspiracies against Alexander, one involving Philotas, the commander of the companion cavalry, and the other involving some of the royal pages who were attendants of the king. Alexander seems to have exploited both of these conspiracies to rid himself of vocal opponents. And I also want to discuss his drunken murder of a senior general named Cleitus the Black, who I referred to before. And finally, I want to examine the view that he was an idealist who wanted to use his power as king to unite the races, that is, Greek and Persian. I'll discuss Alexander's pretensions to personal divinity afterwards, and that will be the final portion for tonight's lecture, which will deal with Alexander as a man and his own personal belief in his divinity, and how we can look at how all of those things affect his kingship. Well, in 330 BC, at Phrada in Bactria, a soldier named Dimnus apparently plotted to kill Alexander. When Dimnus tried to recruit another man named Ceballinus into the conspiracy, Ceballinus told Philotas, the commander of the companion cavalry, about it. Ceballinus didn't have the authority to visit Alexander himself, and so he wanted Philotas to tell the king that what was going on. For some reason, Philotas decided against telling Alexander. Finally, Ceballinus got one of the royal pages. These were these young guys, young boys even, who attended the king. Ceballinus got one of them to smuggle him, Ceballinus, into the royal tent, where he told Alexander about the plot. The king immediately ordered an investigation, which led to the arrest of one Demetrius, one of the royal bodyguards, and to Philotas himself. In the meantime, Dimnus committed suicide. The following day, Philotas was put on trial for treason before an assembly of 6,000 soldiers. Now, we recall that when the Macedonian kings went on campaign, the assembly traveled with him, so to speak, as it would be composed exclusively of soldiers, and the assembly judged cases of treason. Alexander accused Philotas of treason now, and other generals who disliked Philotas personally weighed in against him as well. Philotas said he hadn't told Alexander about the conspiracy because he believed that there was no such thing, and he didn't want to bother Alexander about it. But Philotas was doomed, and Alexander even scolded him for delivering his defense in Greek and not in Macedonian, an interesting kind of linguistic aside there. Philotas was found guilty, and he was executed by javelin. Then Alexander gave orders for the execution of Philotas's father, the veteran general Parmenion. At that time, Parmenion was in Ecbatana, this is modern-day Hamadan, in command of 6,200 Macedonians and 5,600 Greek mercenaries. Parmenion was completely oblivious of what was going on in Alexander's camp in Phrada. A letter came from Alexander addressed to one of the other generals at Ecbatana, ordering him to kill Parmenion, and he did the deed at once. Another letter was then read out to Parmenion's troops to ensure their loyalty to Alexander. Now, there is no question that Philotas was in the wrong for not having informed Alexander about a plot, no matter how imaginary he thought it was. However, Philotas wasn't part of it, because if he were, Ceballinus would hardly have opened up to him about it and urged him to warn the king. And if Philotas happened to be part of a conspiracy, it's very hard to understand why he allowed Ceballinus to live when he was set on telling Alexander about it. Philotas then had nothing to do with the plot, and it would have been enough for Alexander to punish him in some other way, perhaps a demotion. If he really wanted to be mean about it, he could have sent him into exile or something like that. But a trial and condemnation for treason on Alexander's orders were extreme. And even more so was the killing of his father, Parmenion, who was not in Phrada at the time and had no idea about any of it that was taking place. So we have to ask ourselves, what really lies at the heart of the Philotas conspiracy, as modern historians call it? Most people would, I think, see it as Alexander was ridding himself of critics. Philotas had defied Alexander on more than one occasion about the need to continue marching east, and he had also criticized the king's growing Orientalism, and by that I mean Alexander's adoption of Persian customs, Persian dress, even the belief in his own divine status. Once again, we see Alexander as king acting for personal reasons. Once somebody crosses him, there is no redemption. This is a pattern that started with the Thebans and their revolt of 335, and it's not going to get any better. And then there's Parmenion. Parmenion was one of the old guard generals who had served under Philip, and he was also none too happy with the way Alexander was changing. Parmenion was also very powerful and well respected, which is probably why Alexander felt the need to send a letter to Parmenion's troops at Ecbatana in case they rebelled when Parmenion was killed. Under Macedonian law, a traitor's family could be put to death also. So Alexander did have the law on his side, but he also may have felt that he had no choice because of Parmenion's influence and the loyalty that the army had for him. Because after all, if Parmenion had not taken part in the trial and the execution of his son, if he had not taken all of that laying down, Alexander would have had to have gotten rid of him anyway. So even aside from this, Alexander again had a personal reason for wanting to do away with Parmenion. And the real reason why he wanted to, I think, get rid of Parmenion was because he relations between Parmenion and Alexander had been strained for some years. In 334 BC, Alexander had disregarded Parmenion's advice before the Battle of the Granicus River. That was a minor thing, and Alexander as king was perfectly within his rights to overrule his generals. But it started a pattern that was perhaps as much Parmenion's fault in many respects as it was Alexander's, because Parmenion was probably not used to being bossed around by somebody in his early 20s. And even the way that that went down, we are told in our sources that Parmenion had said, he had put it this way, because if I were Alexander, I would not do this. That is, I would not initiate battle at the Granicus. And Alexander retorted with a lot of chutzpah, and nor would I if I were Parmenion. In other words, if I were like, as much of a low energy guy as you, Parmenion, I wouldn't do it either. So it was, you could see there was already a kind of, disrespect occurring there, and contempt on both sides. A major disagreement between the two men was at Tyre in late 331 BC. Darius had sent Alexander a letter offering to surrender all territories of the Euphrates River, west of the Euphrates River, and to become the friend and ally of Alexander. And to sweeten the deal, he would pay him 30,000 talents for the return of his family, whom Alexander had captured following the Battle of Issus in 333 BC. Parmenion thought this offer was too good to refuse, and he urged him to do it, and in much the same kind of way, Alexander replied that he would accept it if he were such a person as Parmenion, but he's not that person, so he's not going to accept it. And this exchange indicates that Parmenion thought that the invasion had achieved its objectives. Indeed, I liken this exchange with the extent to which Philip intended to go into Asia. Parmenion, who was close, companion of Philip, Parmenion would have known about all of this, and that is why I've said on more than one occasion that Philip probably only intended to operate as far as Asia Minor. And therefore, when Darius had made Alexander this offer, he may well have been talking about lands that Philip intended to campaign in, and Parmenion would have known that. So again, we have a clash between Parmenion and Alexander over policy. Then during the Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BC, Parmenion was hard-pressed on the left flank and sent urgently to Alexander for help. The king either did not get the message immediately, or if he did, he decided that he wasn't going to act on it. Either way, no help came. But Parmenion was able to save the flank only by the skin of his teeth. Perhaps we cannot discount that Alexander deliberately left Parmenion to his fate. The declining relations had led Alexander to isolate Parmenion from his court, and that is why he sent him to Ecbatana, which is very remote. The official reason was for Parmenion to oversee Macedonian control of Media and the safety of the great bullion train there. But after that, there was no plans in place for him to rejoin Alexander, and the Philotas conspiracy gave Alexander just the chance he may have wanted, the chance to remove Parmenion permanently. It's even possible that Alexander used Philotas as a pawn, that, in other words, Alexander wanted to get rid of Parmenion and exploited the law about executing a traitor's family by involving Philotas in this plot. Now, I've made a lot out of what happened to Philotas and Parmenion because their fate gives us a disturbing insight into Alexander's growing paranoia and his inability, really, to handle criticism. And if that's not bad enough, the removal of Philotas and Parmenion was at a critical time in the campaign in Bactria and Sogdiana, when Alexander needed all the experienced soldiers that he could get. The army was far from home. The Macedonians were faced by intense guerrilla warfare in these satrapies, and Bessus was still on the loose as parading himself as Artaxerxes V. In the summer of 328 BC, at Samarkand, which at this time was called Marakanda, a drinking party got out of hand when Alexander and Cleitus the Black, one of Alexander's most senior generals and the man who had saved Alexander's life at the Granicus, got into a bitter argument. This argument was in reaction to flatterers at the party trying to outdo one another in their praise of Alexander, but at the expense of Philip. Cleitus was one of those old guard people like Parmenion. He had been one of Philip's generals, and he wasn't going to let anyone trash Philip, and quite rightly so. When Alexander said it was he, Alexander, who had been responsible for victory at Chaeronea, Cleitus saw red, and he tore Alexander a new one, basically, ending with the comment that if it had not been for Cleitus's actions at the Granicus River, Alexander would be dead by now. Of course, this being a Macedonian banquet, everyone present was already very, very drunk, especially Alexander. And so we are told that, well, he attacked Cleitus. Ptolemy, one of Alexander's boyhood friends and the founder of the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt, managed to bundle Cleitus out of the banqueting hall. That is, he separated the two men. But as things calmed down, Cleitus came back in. And not just came back in, but he bounded back in, taunting Alexander further. Perhaps Cleitus's taunts brought back memories of Attilus's taunt at Philip's seventh wedding banquet, when he prayed for a legitimate Macedonian heir. Whatever Alexander, whatever the case of that may be, Alexander, we are told, called out in the Macedonian dialect to his guards so that the Greeks present would not understand. Plutarch tells us this detail. Again, another highlight to show just how different the dialects were. He called out for his spear, and he threw it at Cleitus and killed him on the spot. There was no conspiracy here involving Cleitus. There was nothing to indicate that Alexander thought he was about to be assassinated. Of course, the obvious point is that Cleitus was unarmed. Only the king's personal bodyguard were allowed to bear arms at drinking parties, symposia. And while it is certainly true that Cleitus should not have perhaps talked to his king the way that he did, it's impossible to excuse Alexander's murderous action here. His reason clearly gave way to emotion, which is not a sign of a great king. Again, though, Cleitus was being isolated from the court because Alexander had chosen him to be the new satrap of Bactria. And this was an important position, but it was one that meant that Cleitus would stay where he was while Alexander moved on. And so another member of the old guard, another critic of Alexander's Asian plans and Orientalism, bit the dust. Incidentally, we are told that Alexander was so remorseful, so overcome with grief and horror at what he had done to Cleitus, especially considering that he was unarmed, that he spent the next 3 days in his tent sobbing and weeping and unconsolably about what he had done. Again, it reveals something about his own temperament. A short while later, in Bactria, in 327, another conspiracy against Alexander was discovered. This time, it involved the royal pages. While on a hunt, Alexander had been poised to kill a certain boar when one of the boys, a lad named Hermolaus, in youthful exuberance, killed the boar instead. For this, Hermolaus was publicly caned, and his horse was confiscated. Again, Hermolaus was actually in the wrong. The right to kill the boar was the king's, apparently. But Hermolaus's sort of, usurpation of Alexander's kill here, was the cause for a great deal more than just this punishment that he got, the caning and the horse being taken away. Alexander wanted revenge, and I'm sorry, and Hermolaus wanted revenge for what had been done to him. He apparently persuaded 3 other pages to join him in killing Alexander while the king slept one night. Once the pages stood guard over the king in his bedroom while he slept, the conspiracy had a very good chance of succeeding. Alexander, however, foiled the plot because, according to some sources, he stayed up all night drinking and never made it to bed. And eventually, the details of the conspiracy came out, and these young pages were arrested. So also was the court historian and nephew of Aristotle, Callisthenes. Callisthenes was the one responsible for the pages' education at court. So the pages were tortured and eventually stoned to death, but at no point did they say that Callisthenes was involved in the plot in any way. Nevertheless, Alexander had this man, Callisthenes, the nephew of Alexander, executed as a traitor. The pages' conspiracy was a very odd affair. For one thing, I can understand Hermolaus wanting to get revenge, even though technically he was in the wrong. But why would other pages, who had nothing to do with this hunt, who had not suffered at Alexander's hands, want to help Hermolaus kill the king? What is more, if Alexander went to sleep one night with 4 pages in his bedroom, and the next morning he was found dead with the same 4 pages in the bedroom, it would be pretty obvious who had killed him. Perhaps the other pages had been abused, therefore, in some way by Alexander. We just don't know. But what we do know is that Alexander was up to something by implicating Callisthenes in the plot. It's more than just paranoia on the king's part. And paranoia was certainly part of the pattern of this, of Alexander at this time, of his kind of deterioration, both the deterioration of him as a man and the deterioration of his reign. No matter how senior the critic, no matter where the army was in Asia, the days of anyone who crossed Alexander were numbered. So what had Callisthenes done? Well, earlier in Bactria, Alexander had attempted to introduce the Asian custom of proskinesis, or genuflection, basically making a full prostration to the ground in front of Alexander. The Persian subjects of the great king were used to this sort of thing, of making a full prostration where they would get on their hands and knees and touch their forehead to the ground in front of him. This was the sign of submission to your king in Persia. But to the Greeks, this was basically blasphemy. It was kind of like tantamount to worshiping a living man. Greeks were accustomed to greet one another, even their king, as equals. They would give them each other a kiss on the cheek. So this whole gesture of lying prostrate on the ground, flat on the ground, that really just did not fly for the Greeks. That was just not part of their custom at all. They really did not take to that. They saw that as being kind of slavish and Eastern. So Callisthenes refused to perform it, and the other men in Alexander's court also followed suit, which forced Alexander to abandon the attempt of forcing this custom, this Persian custom, upon his Greek subjects. However, the moment that any man defied Alexander, as I just said, basically meant that his days were numbered. All Alexander needed was a scenario to justify removing Callisthenes, and the pages' conspiracy gave him just that. Perhaps we should not be surprised, therefore, that Ephipos, who is a contemporary source, said that people living at Alexander's court did so in a reign of fear. As king, Alexander insisted on spreading Greek civilization throughout Asia. And of course, we can all look at that as being a very beautiful thing, a very important thing. Of course, the most important aspect of this spread of Greek culture around the Near East came in the Greek language. Alexander's campaigns throughout Asia made the Greek language kind of like what English is, the lingua franca, or the common speech among many different people who do not speak the Greek language natively, but they spoke it as a kind of universal second language. And this would actually, in time, in several centuries' time, give rise to the ability of Christianity to spread throughout the Near East, because the Greek language was known by so many people. It is one of the reasons why the New Testament is written in Greek. However, Alexander made no attempt to recognize local customs when they contradicted what Greeks thought about them, or ones that he personally disliked. A case in point was the Bactrian custom of killing their elderly or the infirm. A contemporary source says the following, quote, "Those who become infirm because of old age or sickness are thrown out alive as prey to dogs, which they keep specifically for this purpose, and in their native tongue they are called undertakers. While the land outside the walls of the city of the Bactrians looks clean, most of the land inside the walls is full of human bones." End quote. Alexander ended this custom because the Greeks considered it barbaric. Now, of course, this caused discontent through play, and this type of ending of customs that that existed throughout the Near East and under the areas that were now subject to Alexander and the rest of the Greeks. This caused discontent throughout all the places that Alexander ruled, and it affected his kingship enormously. One belief about Alexander that contributes to the image of him as a great king is that he was an idealist who strove to unite the different races of the Near East and the Greeks into one. The idea is that he had a policy towards a homonoia of mankind, or a unity of mankind, a kind of concord of humanity. This issue is important because it has a bearing on how we should consider the historical Alexander, the real Alexander. Several events in Alexander's reign have been seen as his desire to establish this brotherhood of mankind. These include his his integration of foreigners into his army and administration, such as his specialist troops from Iran, and it also includes the use of native satraps or rulers in the provinces, the satrapies of the Persian Empire. And then there is also his marriage in the spring of 327 to the Bactrian princess Roxanne. And then furthermore, his attempt to adopt the Persian custom of Paroskinisis at his court, and also a mass wedding at Susa in 324, where Alexander and 91 members of his court married various Persian noblewomen. And then finally at Opus in 324, when he put down the mutiny that I described earlier, he held then a great reconciliation banquet at which the sources say Macedonian, Greek, and Persians sipped from the same cup, and Alexander prayed for the homonoia among everyone, that is, the harmony of all, the homonoia ton panton. None of these had any ideological purpose other than a pragmatic one, I think. They're all capable of being explained on purely pragmatic and non-ideological terms. For example, foreigners in his army were kept apart in their own ethnic units, and native satraps were merely titular figures, used as a link between their own people and himself, because control of the all-important military reserves and control of the treasury were always in the hands of the Macedonians alone. You would expect foreigners in the army to be mixed up among existing regiments, not kept sort of banded together in their own ethnic units. Alexander was using these troops because of their specialist skills. So that explains that. As for the marriage to Roxanne, this was in the same vein as his father's political marriages, because Roxanne's father had been one of his recent opponents in Bactria, so he wanted to kind of win him over through marriage. Marriage to the daughter now earned Alexander the support of her father, and with any luck, that might bring with it the passivity of Bactria. So Alexander is really just taking a leaf out of his father's book here and marrying Roxanne for political reasons. He's not having this kind of interracial marriage to show that he's trying to set a new trend in any way of uniting the races. The proskinesis attempt, that is the full prostration thing that I've just talked about before, this is very intriguing because it looks like Alexander was trying to fashion some sort of common social protocol between the different elements, the different racial elements at his court, the Persian and the Greek. But at the same time, he knew that the Greeks thought the actual act of proskinesis was offensive, not to say sacrilegious. Right, they only worshipped gods and dead heroes in this fashion. So a little more likely explanation, as we will see in a moment, actually, is that Alexander now thought himself as divine, and proskinesis was meant for everyone to recognize that. While the symbolism of the interracial mass marriage at Susa might seem obvious, it is important to note that no Greek women were brought out from the mainland to marry Asian noblemen. And we would expect this if Alexander was truly sincere about a fusion policy between the races. So what it seems more likely to me is that what Alexander was doing was simply kind of diluting the bloodline to ensure that children from these marriages would never have a claim to the Persian throne. And it is a fact that in Iran to this day, the people can still remember this mass marriage at Susa, and they still criticize Alexander for it. In fact, they even refer to Alexander as the accursed one. And there are still traces of, the Macedonian and Greek genetic um, inheritance to be found in a lot of these populations. There is a very, very famous picture of an Afghan woman from the 1980s from National Geographic, where she has these very intense green eyes. You probably have seen this picture. I believe that woman is still alive to this day. Actually, she was a very young woman when that picture was taken. Now she's very old. But if you look for that, you can see that. And the only way that a person in Afghanistan would have shocking green eyes, obviously, would be if some European DNA was kind of injected into it, into that gene pool. Finally, the common banquet and the prayer for harmony after the Opus Mutiny. This is one of the most famous biographers of Alexander of all time, W. Tarn. He makes a great deal out of this thing, and he says that this is really this attempt at homonoia or concord among the races. But we should note that at this reconciliation banquet, there was a conscious seating order to emphasize superiority. Macedonians sat next to Alexander, then Greeks, and then the others. There was no mixing up of the people as we would expect if this is what he was really going for, this concord of the races. So the prayer for future concord was really more, I think, about unity in the army, putting aside grievances in the army in the face of, for the sake of unity, and not for some kind of pie in the sky unity of mankind. Alexander planned to invade Arabia next, and so dissension in the ranks was the last thing he wanted. Nevertheless, this legendary Alexander, exemplified as an attempted unifier of the races, definitely very much kind of, the biggest scholarly witness to this, or the biggest scholarly kind of voice that argues for this is this W. Tarn from the early 20th century. But certainly more recently, the same idea appeared in Oliver Stone's 2004 movie, which in effect is really just another addition to the Alexander legend. Although the 1956 movie, directed by Robert Rawson, with Richard Burton as Alexander, has its flaws, at least it captures more of what made Alexander tick, I think. And there's nothing in there to try to show that Alexander was trying to unite the races. The sorts of things that I've been talking about now, and really, I've only kind of scratched the surface, have to affect Alexander as a king, and especially whether we can blindly still call him great. But perhaps the best way to assess his greatness is by his legacy. Compared to what his father Philip left him, Alexander's legacy is woeful. He did not produce an heir when he died. Roxanne was still pregnant. Even though his senior generals kept urging him to do so, he disregarded that advice. And on his deathbed, Alexander gave his signet ring to his second in command, Perdiccas, which perhaps meant that he wanted Perdiccas to be his successor, but the other generals so disliked Perdiccas that they had no intention of following him. And as a result, with no clear successor, chaos ensued as the generals carved up or fought each other to carve up Alexander's empire amongst themselves when the king died in 323. There followed literally 30 years, 3 decades of bloody civil war during which Greek and Macedonia were battlegrounds among the successors, the Diadochoi, before the great kingdoms of the Hellenistic period, Syria, Egypt, and Macedonia and / Greece appeared. So one could certainly argue that Alexander's military victories or his that his military victories or his actions as kings do not outweigh his legacy or justify his greatness. And this is just as true when we consider Alexander the man, which is what I want to do now in this final portion of the lecture. How was Alexander as a man? We cannot omit a consideration of one of the most controversial aspects of Alexander's reign when we answer this question or try to analyze this question, and that is whether Alexander came to believe he was actually a god on earth. There are plenty of examples to support this view, but in this final portion of the lecture, I will discuss some of the more major ones, and I've selected these from his entire reign. And these episodes that illustrate or help shed light on this question of did Alexander actually think he was God, a god, include his visit to the oracle of Apollo at Didyma and to the oracle of Zeus Ammon at the oasis of Siwa in Egypt. Also, I'm going to reconnect with that whole controversy that I already was talking about now of his attempt to impose proskinesis or prostration upon all of his members of court. Also, we can tie this in with Alexander's motive for invading Arabia and his identification with the god Dionysius, the attitude of his court and army towards the end of his reign, and finally, the influence of his own father's Philip's divinity. And after all of that, I want to make some concluding remarks about Alexander and about the events in Greece during his reign. The story of Alexander's divinity began with the legends about his divine conception that I've already mentioned in our previous lecture. But as I said at that time, we have no idea whether these stories were circulating when Alexander was a child or whether he himself put them out later when he was a king. So what I will discuss now are simply the examples that I've selected that we know about and that we have the dates for, and which have a bearing on Alexander's pretensions to personal divinity. They begin with his visit to the oracle of Apollo at Didyma in the autumn of 334 BC. The oracle of Apollo at Didyma is not to be confused with the oracle of Apollo at Delphi, by the way. The Didyma oracle had not spoken since the time of the Persian Wars, but when Alexander arrived, Apollo began to speak again. Furthermore, he apparently said that Alexander was a son of Zeus. Then after the severing of the Gordian knot in 333 BC, a violent thunderstorm occurred that night that Alexander interpreted as Zeus greeting the man destined to rule Asia, of course, himself. Alexander then sacrificed to Zeus the next morning. There's nothing to indicate here that Alexander thought he was divine, and since his family lineage could be traced back to Zeus, his sacrifice at Gordian was a sign of piety. But then Alexander went to Egypt, and things would never be the same again. For one thing, although Alexander was never crowned pharaoh, he took on the attributes of the pharaoh. That is, since the Egyptians worshipped their pharaohs, this meant that they now worshipped Alexander as a god on earth. But it was Alexander's visit to the oracle of Zeus Ammon in the Libyan desert at an oasis called Siwa that was the turning point in his divinity, because it was at this oracle that Alexander the man became Alexander the putative god. Alexander's reason for going to Siwa was to pay thanks to Zeus for his successes to date, So that would be another illustration of Greek piety. And significantly, he wanted to ask a number of questions of the god. These included whether Zeus was his real father, and whether all of those implicated in Philip's assassination had been punished. Apollo at Didyma had told him he was Zeus's son, but Zeus's thunderous greeting at Gordian did not mean that the future ruler of Asia really was his son. So Alexander needed to hear the, quote, truth from Zeus himself. What is significant about this visit to Siwa, though, is that Alexander always intended to be told he was a son of Zeus. A contemporary source says that Alexander wanted to learn, quote, his own origin more certainly, or at least that he might be able to say that he had learned it, quote, end quote. In other words, it didn't really matter if he was going to be told he was or wasn't the son of Zeus. He was going to say that he was anyway. The march across the desert to the oracular site was a harsh one for the men because of the natural environment. It took the men a fortnight instead of the more usual 1 week to make it to Siwa. They lost their way many times because of sandstorms. Their food and water ran out, and they were battered by flash floods and the extreme temperatures by day and night. The march gave rise to all sorts of stories, including talking snakes sent by Zeus to guide the men on their way when they got lost, but eventually they did make it. And the oracle was inside of a mud brick fortress in the center of the oasis at Siwa. You can still go and visit it to this day. And as Alexander approached the Egyptian priest of Apollo there, he was greeted by this Egyptian priest who apparently didn't speak Greek very well, who said to him, he wanted to say to him, Chaire o Paidion, which means, hail, my little boy, my little child, something like affectionate like that. But instead, there was a bit of a mistake in the declensional ending there. And instead of saying o Paidion, he said Chaire o Paidios, which means, hail, O son of Zeus, O child of Zeus. Now, today, we might look at this as kind of being, just a problem of, linguistics or whatever. But this accidental slip on the part of the priest, of this foreigner attempting to speak Greek, Alexander absolutely took the priest literally because the priest said exactly what he wanted to hear. He wanted to be greeted as a son of Zeus. Now, we don't know what the priest told Alexander at Siwa because the king met him in private when he went to consult the oracle. We only have Alexander's word for what happened, and that's, not terribly trustworthy, is it? But after the meeting, Alexander came out and said that he had received every answer he wanted, and that meant yes to all the murderers of Philip had been punished. So therefore, the god was exculpating Alexander of any suspicion of complicity in the plot. And it also meant, when he says that he got all the answers that he wanted, that he was also the son of Zeus. He told his men that the priest had said Philip was merely his mortal father, and from that time Alexander referred to himself as a son of Zeus, not a descendant of Zeus, right? Which in the Greek world, all aristocratic families like to kind of portray themselves as, having a god as their origin, their kind of prime progenitor. But this is a very important difference for Alexander. The Macedonian ruling dynasty traced its ancestry back to Zeus and Heracles, as I've said, and no Greek would have batted an eye over that sort of thing. But it was one thing to say you were a descendant of a god, and yet another entirely to say that you were the living son of one. And as we'll see, this would come back to bite Alexander hard. I would suggest also that it was at this time that Alexander put out, or at least sanctioned, the stories of his divine conception and of Artemis bringing him into the world to give his new divine status some pedigree. Alexander was setting himself up as divine, therefore, even from conception, and that would tie in with the priest's comment that Philip was only his mortal father. Another event that stands out is in Alexander's promotion of his personal divinity is this issue of the proskinesis. At Bactria in 327 BC, as we know, Alexander tried to enforce this Asian custom of prostration on his own Macedonian and Greek men. And it has been argued that Alexander wanted to establish a form of common social protocol between Greeks and Asians so that everyone would greet him in much the same way. Just like today, some people have different ways of greeting others, and depending on the occasion, we normally shake hands or we bow or curtsy. When I remember when, uh, Obama went to greet the Queen of England, and Michelle Obama had to curtsy in front of her and stuff like that. And then when he went over to greet the Emperor of Japan, he kind of winged it and sort of shook his hand while bowing at the same time. There's a kind of funny picture of that. Um, there are different kind of protocols, and so for different kinds of ethnic, leaders and stuff like that, different, cultures have different way of greeting one another. But having just this one way for Alexander to be greeted by those coming into his presence seems to be bound up with the idea that he was trying to promote, well, at least it has been interpreted historically, in the 20th century at least, to be an idea that he was trying to promote a unity of mankind. But I have argued against that, as I've said, and I explored that a moment ago. I think that Alexander simply was brought up to believe in the traditional gods and religious practices and beliefs of the Greeks. So he knew very well that the Greeks would consider the act of prostration before a living man blasphemous. This was what separated the Greeks from the Asians. So if Alexander wanted them all of a sudden to have the same type of greeting for him, he must have known he was heading into trouble. Prostration implied worship of a living man, and he knew that the Greeks only worshipped gods or dead heroes. Alexander must have known that he was heading into trouble, as I said, and must have known that his men would resent this thing that he was trying to get them to do. Perhaps they even, they even tried to resist him, as we know Callisthenes, the nephew of Aristotle, did, and he paid the ultimate price for that. So this leaves the only explanation, for me at least, that makes sense for why Alexander tried to introduce this custom is that he now thought of himself as a god and wanted his men to acknowledge this as well. Proskinesis was the most obvious way. And this ties in with a comment expressed by one of the philosophers at his court at the time, a man named Anaxarchus, who said that since Alexander was going to be worshipped when he was dead anyway, he may as well be worshipped while he is alive. If one skips ahead to the last years of Alexander's reign, after the Hephaestus mutiny in 326, Alexander was forced to turn back from India, and as he did so, he set his sights on Arabia. He had several motives for invading Arabia, most obviously the first one being trade and further conquest. But a contemporary source tells us that the Arabs worshipped only two gods, Uranos, and that is Uranus, the one of the primordial deities, Gaia and Uranos, and Dionysius. And this same source goes on to say that Alexander, quote, thought of himself quite worthy to be considered by the Arabs a third god, since he had performed deeds by no means inferior to those of Dionysius, end quote. It is during Alexander's Indian campaign that he moved away from emulating the deeds of Heracles, one of his putative ancestors, and identified himself more closely with Dionysius. This is significant because Heracles was born mortal and he was apotheosized on death, whereas Dionysius was born a god. Heracles was no longer good enough, in other words, for Alexander. Alexander now saw himself as a god, like Dionysius, not like Heracles, who didn't make it to divine status until he had died. Now, then there's another issue, something that I haven't talked about really, and that is the heroic cult of Alexander's companion Hephaestion. Hephaestion had been one of Alexander's boyhood friends, and he became Alexander's closest confidant as the reign progressed. In 324, Hephaestion died, and Alexander was inconsolable. The whole empire was to be in mourning. Funeral games were to be held in his honor, that is, honor of Hephaestion, and so on. There's all sorts of Homeric echoes here. as if Alexander and Hephaestion had a sort of Achilles-Patroclus kind of relationship, if you know the Iliad. Um, and of course, when Achilles found out that Patroclus had died, he went into deep mourning. And one of the things Alexander did to honor his friend was to have this huge set of kind of funeral games for him, just like Book 23 of the Iliad, when Achilles has these games for Patroclus. Now, another thing that he did, though, to honor his friend, was to have a hero cult set up to him. A heros. Okay, a heros in the Greek word, the hero, meant something different. We don't, when we think of hero, we think of fireman, we think of, I don't know, that pilot who landed the plane on the Hudson River and saved all those people from death, somebody like that. But no, a heros in ancient Greek meant a person who had become a god through heroic action, through, which meant conquest and battle and stuff like that, and therefore had could receive divine honors. Okay. Um, so this was granted to Hephaestion in May of 323, simply 1 month actually before Alexander died himself. And this cult, this sacrificial, they would offer, sacrifices of animals and wine and incense and those kind of things to Hephaestion. This meant that he was now basically a demigod. However, if Hephaestion were a demigod, that made Alexander his superior in a sense, because Hephaestion was not the king's equal, and Alexander, couldn't elevate his friend even if he were dead to a level above himself. And that meant that Alexander, for all intents and purposes, saw himself as a living god. If he had arranged for Hephaestion to be a demigod, the next one up for a demigod is to be 100% God. So we can see that in this final year of Alexander's life, a contemporary source is saying that incense was burned in his presence and everybody observed a reverential silence. Both of these indicate a cult to Alexander while he was yet alive. Of course, there is a huge difference between divine pretensions and actually thinking oneself a god. Did Alexander really think he was a god, or was he just exploiting his divine associations for the political and even morale-boosting advantages that they offered? For example, the Macedonians had to be disheartened by the huge number of Persian troops at Gaugamela, even if the lowest estimates of 200,000 were correct. That would make that army enormous. Before the battle, Alexander prayed for a sign from his father Zeus, and an eagle swooped down onto the Persian line. Did Alexander really think that Zeus was showing the Persians would lose that day? Or did he quickly turn what an eagle happened to do into something else as a means of exhorting his men? Conning them, if you like. Oh, look at that eagle over there. That means that Zeus is with us. He sent us a sign. This would have given men heart, despite the numerical superiority of the Persians. Well, I think that Alexander did come to see himself, actually, as a god. We cannot come up with any other plausible explanation for this, and particularly for the proskinesis attempt, the religious motivation for, having himself be worshipped. That's the only thing that really makes sense. Likewise, the religious motive for invading Arabia, the cult of Hephaestion, all of this, and the reverential cult to Alexander himself, all of this only speaks to his idea that he really did see himself as divine. There was also the matter of embassies from the Greek polis that went to meet him at Babylon in 323. These embassies from the Greek states wore gold crowns, and they brought with them gold crowns, and this is what one did when one honored a god. But that doesn't mean that these Greek embassies believed that Alexander was God. The previous year, in 324, Alexander had issued an order that all exiles apart from the Thebans were to return to their native cities, and the Greeks were protesting this. What better way to endear themselves to him? What better way to have him agree to their request of, we don't want our exiles back, thank you very much. What better way than to kind of suck up to him as if he were divine? This is shown, I think, by Demosthenes' contemptuous comment that he uttered at this time, quote, Alexander can be the son of Zeus and of Poseidon if he wants to be. In other words, He could be whatever he wants. I don't care. I don't believe it, but let him think it. We know that Alexander was worshipped by the Egyptians. He wanted to be worshipped by the Arabs, and he wanted to be worshipped by his own people, the Greeks. That would lead to his undoing. Proskenius showed that he had lost touch with his men, and when the army mutinied on him at Opis in 324, this is the second mutiny, the men sarcastically told him that if he wanted to go to Arabia, he could do so with his father Zeus helping him out. The men had long been dissatisfied with Alexander's Orientalism at seeing their generals who criticized him being put to death. And they were tired, obviously, of given the comment that I just made of Alexander's belief in his divinity. As I said, descendant of Zeus was very different from son of Zeus, and this backfired on Alexander. And that is why the origins of these later mutinies lie in Hekatompelos. That is where the men first started to express dissatisfaction with Alexander's continued march eastwards, and eventually everything would blow up in Alexander's face. But did Alexander come to think of himself as a god on the scale, as the scale of his achievements grew? In other words, was there kind of like a snowball effect over the years? Or did he always intend to set himself up as divine? Well, I think the answer points to the latter, and that in pointing to the latter, we see Philip's influence here, which is a point I would like to develop for you now. We've already traced the deteriorating relations between Philip and Alexander, especially in those years after Chaeronea and before Philip's assassination. Alexander's admiration for his father changed to one of resentment, especially when Philip intended him to be just regent of Macedonia and not go chasing Persians. Eager for military glory, Alexander pushed ahead with his father's plan to invade Asia once he became king. But while Alexander might have intended to conquer on a larger geographical scale than his father had planned to do, and so create a far larger empire, he was still going to be doing what Philip had done, fighting and conquering, that is. And it was Philip who had laid the foundations for the Macedonian Empire and developed the plan to invade Asia. Alexander then would simply be following in Philip's footsteps. The scale might be different, as I said, but to Alexander that would not mean much. We know this because look at how he reacted to Cleitus's comparison of him to Philip. Alexander wanted to do more than Philip then, and two areas that would propel him ahead of his father would be in establishing an absolute monarchy, which is what he was moving towards at the time of his death, and being worshipped as a god while alive. After all, if he were deified only on his death, as Philip had been, there would be again no difference between the two men. Plus, Alexander was impatient. That is why he made so much fuss out of reviving Apollo at Didyma. That the oracle would have called him the son of Zeus by way of thanks for restoring it after its fate in the Persian Wars was immaterial. Alexander had done something that Philip had never done. He had brought back an oracle to life, and Siwa was the icing on the cake. Wanting to eclipse the exploits of his father and to be a god while he was alive became the be-all and the end-all of Alexander's reign. And I think it is this that motivated him. That made him tick. In the process, he was prepared to ignore his men's religious scruples, but with dire consequences. And that is something we could never say about Philip, who never lost touch with the rank and file of his army. And to put it bluntly, he was just too savvy to do something that would risk everything. So now, what do you think? Alexander's military achievements were spectacular, and the world he opened up to the Greeks equally so. But does a king deserve to be called great when he was responsible for the unnecessary wholesale slaughter of native peoples and tens of thousands of his own men? Does a man deserve to be called great when he, as a king and a man, would be, if he were alive today, be put on trial for war crimes? If he were a king who didn't produce an undisputed heir to succeed him and therefore plunged his empire into 30 years of civil war that saw that empire ripped apart, a king and a man whose violent temper on occasion and growing paranoia led him to engineer the executions of his friends and generals and on one occasion to kill one of them in cold blood. And finally, a king who, towards the end of his life, was a megalomaniac who believed in his own divinity and risked all for his own personal self-aggrandizement. Well, I leave that question to you. Does such a man deserve to be called great? I leave that to you to think about. But I would like to end this lecture now just simply with some brief consideration of Greece, especially Athens, during Alexander's absence in Asia, and also this will bring in the end of Demosthenes' later career. We've already said that Greece remained cowed during Antipater's regency, apart from the abortive war of Agis III from 331 to 330 BC. In 330 BC, the enmity between Demosthenes and Aeschines reached a head in court. We have a speech that's called, well, we have a trial that is called the Crown Trial. Some years earlier, Demosthenes had been crowned on the proposal of a politician named Ctesiphon for Demosthenes' great services to the state. It was an honorary crown, a wreath of laurel. This would be like getting a medal or something like that today. Demosthenes was a serving magistrate at the time, and under Athenian law, he could not receive a crown in this way, so the matter was dropped. But in 330, some years later, Aeschines, his enemy, brought a charge against Ctesiphon. Aeschines is Demosthenes' enemy. He brought a charge against Ctesiphon. The charge was that he should never have proposed crowning Demosthenes in the first place, and moreover, that the reason why Ctesiphon wanted Demosthenes crowned for his great services to the state was bogus. So Aeschines then delivered this long prosecution speech against Ctesiphon, but in reality, Aeschines was attacking Demosthenes, because most of Aeschines' prosecution speech had to do with Demosthenes' policy towards Macedonia. Ctesiphon would be expected to deliver the defense speech, and he did, but he also didn't. Ctesiphon stood up and delivered a very short introductory speech. He probably simply said, "I'm sorry," and then he sat down again. Then Demosthenes stood up, and Demosthenes delivered his defense speech. The title of it is On the Crown. Okay? It is the greatest example of Greek prose ever. It was such an amazing speech, and it still exists. You can read the entire thing. It was such an amazing speech that Aeschines was blasted out of court. He failed to win even 1/5 of the votes cast, and as a result, Aeschines left Athens and retired to the island state of Rhodes, where he set up a school of rhetoric. Story goes that he used to read his speech, the speech against Ctesiphon, to his students, and they used to marvel at it, and they would say, "Why on earth did you lose?" Aeschines would say, "Ah, if only you had heard Demosthenes, you would know why." Well, we have both of these speeches, actually, which is very unusual in Greek oratory. Unusual to have both sides of the case, prosecution and defense. Everyone who learns Greek at some time or another has to read Demosthenes' On the Crown. I had to read it from my reading list for my PhD. It is a fantastic speech, and you could certainly do an entire lecture series just on that. Maybe I will. Returning to Demosthenes, though, it was the case that in 330, Demosthenes was still carrying some political ascendancy in Athens. Even though we don't know what speeches he was making in the assembly, he was still a player, but Aeschines was now out of the scene. Things then go quiet in Athens until 324, that is the year before Alexander dies, and it is the year in which I just mentioned Alexander issued what was called the Exiles Decree, which was an order that all exiles, apart from the Thebans, were to return to their native cities. It was also in that year that his imperial treasurer, a man named Harpalus, fled from his headquarters at Babylon and returned to Athens. Harpalus fled in fear of his life, because while Alexander was in India, Harpalus had led a corrupt and dissolute lifestyle, and now the past was sort of catching up to him. Alexander wanted him and would have him put to death for his extortionate lifestyle. Harpalus took with him a large sum of money, a number of troops, a number of ships, and fled to Athens. He had honorary citizenship in Athens because he had given a gift of grain to the city during a famine a few years earlier. So therefore, he was claiming political asylum. And this meant that the city had to let him in because he was a citizen. But at the same time, this shows that even in 324, Athens was still a player on the mainland. Athens was the only place that Harpalus thought he could go to that might rouse a revolt of the Greeks against Macedonia. And that is why Harpalus went there. We don't need to go into all the details of what's called the Harpalus affair. There is a very good book written about this by Ian Worthington, who I mentioned to you in our last lecture. The book is called A Historical Commentary on Dinarchus, and it goes into it. Ian Worthington, from whom I have gotten so much as the basis for these lectures. The thing about the Harpalus affair is that Demosthenes got involved in it. He had Harpalus imprisoned, but shortly afterwards, Harpalus escaped from prison and fled to Crete. He eventually died over there. When it was discovered that only half of the money that Harpalus had brought with him was actually in Athens, a number of politicians were suspected of receiving a bribe from him. Demosthenes was one of them, and he was put on trial in 323 BC. And even though there was no evidence against him, Demosthenes was found guilty of taking a bribe from Harpalus, and this was treason, and as a result, Demosthenes fled into exile. So that's the removal of Demosthenes from political life in Athens. He fell victim, essentially, to a political trial. And then in June 323, Alexander died. When this news reached the Greeks, it was at first disbelieved. The orator Demades said that if Alexander were dead for real, the whole world would, quote, reek of his corpse, end quote. But when the news was confirmed, the Greeks revolted from the League of Corinth in what is called the Lamian War. This war didn't last for long. In fact, Antipater ended it in the following year, 322, and during the Lamian War, Demosthenes returned home. But when Antipater ended the Greek revolt, he brought an end to democracy in Athens, and so therefore called for the surrender of all anti-Macedonian politicians, and that included, of course, Demosthenes. Rather than be handed over to Antipater, Demosthenes fled, but he was hunted down, and apparently, as Macedonian agents were about to grab him, he committed suicide by drinking poison. And so it is that we end the classical period. The death of Alexander the Great ends the classical period, and we move now into the third period of ancient Greek history, known as the Hellenistic period, which traditionally is dated from 323 BC with the death of Alexander to 31 BC, when the last of the great Hellenistic kingdoms, Ptolemaic Egypt, falls to the Romans. At which point Greek history becomes subsumed within Roman history. The legacy of Alexander and Philip for that matter, didn't have any influence on the workings of Greek democracy and law, which were the two of the big prongs around which our course has been focused. The Greeks were still able to exercise these two things, democracy and law, given the rights guaranteed to them in the League of Corinth. But as we have seen, Philip and Alexander did have influence on the Greeks by ending the imperialistic ambitions of many polis and then Greek autonomy. The impact of these two kings on the Greeks signaled the end of the classical period, just as the impact of the Persian Wars had signaled the end of the Archaic period. Greece back then, at the end of the Archaic period, then moved into a new phase and a new period, the classical period, and it was marked especially by the growth in imperialism, as we've discussed. And now, after Alexander, it is not just Greece, but it is the Greek world that again moves into a new phase and period, the Hellenistic period. And we will discuss this at the start of our next and final lecture. Thank you.